9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 29. The Fellowship Reunited. 9? Seven cried, running towards the resurrected Stitchpunk as fast as her legs could carry her. She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him, unable to believe it. Her heart raced as she stared at 9, her lips stretched in a wide smile. As she looked back at her, his eyes glowed a bright green for just a moment, before dissolving into a pair of normal black. She was vastly overwhelmed as she stared at the young man, shaking her head slightly. He was alive. 9 smiled right back at her with a very familiar crooked grin. 7? He replied softly, a small, breathless rasp etched in his voice. 7's heart gave a joyful leap at hearing his voice once more. She could only continue to stare at him, trying to comprehend the impossible that had suddenly become reality. 9 couldn't help but return her gaze, unable to look away from the beautiful young woman that had saved him, that he had been allowed to come back to. However, her face was strangely blurred. Even after he blinked several times, 9 remembered that his optic was broken, and he sighed deeply, closing his eyes. He winced as he was reminded that the body he came back to was broken, tattered, and weak. Being back to his own body felt strange, almost it was surreal to feel again. But he was extremely relieved that he could. Every bit of pain just meant that he was alive and that he wasn't leaving again. He pulled in another painful breath, grimacing as sharp pain spiked in his chest. 7 watched him as he reached forward, trying to stand. 7 immediately got to her feet and eased 9 to his own. She grasped his hand and wrapped an arm around his middle. Slowly and gently, 7 lifted 9 up, keeping a strong hold on him. When he swayed, his knees trembled. 9 shakily placed a hand on his forehead, wincing at the sudden vertigo overwhelming him. He stood on uncertain feet, as if he was taking his first steps again. 7 braced him, keeping her arms sound him as he regained his balance. She shook her head lightly, unable to believe it. She simply couldn't believe it. He was alive. He had come home. 9 finally regained his unsteady balance. 7 placed a hand on his chest to steady him. He inhaled slowly and exhaled the same. His eyes closed as he gained his bearings. After a moment, he opened them and looked at 7. He smiled warmly at her, knowing just how much he missed her. He reached up and with a shaky hand and squeezed her shoulder. I'm home, he said softly. 7 cried out and wrapped her arms around him as tightly as she could, her face buried in his neck. She sobbed hard, closing her eyes tightly. 9 staggered, startled. 7 was careful with his frail body, but that didn't stop her from digging her fingers into his back. The emotions she had tried to keep behind her shield, the emotions that had been building and that had all been raging within her flooded forth. She made no attempt to stop them as she cried, feeling weak with relief. 7, it's okay. Don't cry, Sev. I'm here, she said soothingly, trying to comfort the young woman. He lightly rested his hands on her back, patting lightly. I thought I lost you. I thought I'd lost you forever, 7 whispered, her voice shaking, her breathing hitched, unable to stop the wave of emotions from crashing over her. She could feel his unusual loving warmth return, making him almost glow. Seven pressed her palms into his shoulders, holding on to him as if planned to never let go. Nine looked down at her, watching as she embraced him. The sheer raw emotion of reuniting with the beautiful young woman was not lost on him. He raised his arms and wrapped them around Seven, holding her close to his heart. She murmured as he did so. He held her closely, knowing that he had missed her dearly and was deeply relieved that he was allowed the second chance. It's all right. I'm here now. It's going to be okay, he said softly, rocking her back and forth slowly, his voice soothing her, and her sobs slowly quieted. She then pulled away from him and looked into his warm eyes. The certain glow of life had returned to him. 9, she said softly, with gently resting her hands on his cheek, feeling the textures and patterns of his rough burlap skin. 9 raised his hand and covered hers, smiling softly. For a length of 2 heartbeats, the 2 young Stitchpunk looked at each other's eyes. The male Stitchpunk then inclined his head, gently touching the optics of his optics to Seven's. They stood like this for a moment, the young woman feeling as if everything was right with the world. He was standing before her, very real, very much alive. She studied his features, looking into his eyes. He had come back to her, and she wasn't going to lose him again. Seven nuzzled his optics with her own, then moved away slightly, only to rest her head on his shoulders, feeling his burlap skin against her cheek. She wrapped her arms around him and held him close. Fingers tightened on his back, as if she wanted to make sure he was never taken from her again. 9 held her to him, touching his cheeks to the side of her head and stroking the back of his gently. She sighed, allowing herself to become lost in his embrace. She could feel his heartbeat against her own chest, and she listened to it attentively, providing reassurance that he was there. 9 couldn't fathom how relieved he was, despite the pain still tearing at him, the happiness overshadowing any of it. She was the only thing that mattered right now. She had brought him back, and he was finally home. Suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps as 5 appeared, wringing his hands nervously as he came to comfort the crying 7. He had heard her shout and came to make sure that she was all right. 7? Are you okay? I heard you... 5 began to ask gently. However, as he approached her formed through the mist, his words trailed off pathetically as his eyes fell upon the scene. His eye grew wide and his jaw dropped in utter disbelief and bewilderment. The 2 younger Stitchpunks turned to look at 5, smiling widely at him. The one-eyed Stitchpunk shook his head and completely stunned and bewildered. 9? He managed to gasp, shaking his head in befuddlement, blinking as his face crumbled. Looking like he was about to cry, he had just said goodbye to 9. He was never going to see him again, and yet, here he was, alive. The younger Stitchpunk smiled widely, giving a sigh of relief. 9 gently removed himself from 7's grasp, turning towards the one-eyed man. He shuffled towards 5, still limping heavily and barely able to stand. However, he managed to approach the petrified ragdoll, although the feature before him was slightly blurred. He could still see the disbelief in his face. 5 remained shocked and frozen to the spot, unable to walk forward. 9? 5 whispered his name in astonishment and shock. Taking a step backwards, 9 nodded, reaching out with a reassuring hand. I'm here, 5. Every last bit of me. 9 said softly. Five shook his head tightly, as if this was just a cruel joke. The resurrected Stitchpunk paused, keeping his hand intact and extended. Five then finally took a hesitant step forward, approaching Nine now. He still looked shocked and frightened. When Nine couldn't help but smile widely, the happiness that overcame him, unsettling around every inch he had, pushed away the horrid memories of the last 3 months. They were both standing very much alive. Before the other, Five stared at Nine, finally reaching back with a quivering hand. Five clasped his forearm tightly, giving the breathless laugh of pure joy. Five grasped the other arm, shaking his head again as he felt the rough burlap, similar to his own, beneath his fingers. Five blinked in realization that his face lit up. A large smile spread across his cheeks, and he gave a strangled gasp of joy and relief. "Nine! Nine, you're alive!" Five exclaimed, sobbing in joy as he wrapped his arms around Nine, embracing him tightly in pure relief and overpowering happiness. His best friend was alive. He had come back. Nine wrapped his arms around Five as well, holding him closely and resting his head on his shoulder. Five was careful with his frail body, but couldn't help but hold his younger brother tightly, weeping in relief and rocking Nine slowly. "I thought I'd never see you again," Five whispered. "We stick together, remember?" he replied, his chin quivering as he hugged his brother. Five gave a shuddering sigh filled with nothing but joy. The two embraced for a moment longer before Five withdrew and held up a finger. Running back towards the house, Nine looked at him in confusion as Seven came forward to hold him up. Five hopped the stairs and ran across the porch. The light that he had lost when Nine died returned to his entire being. He stood at the door, cupping a hand around his mouth. "Guys!" Five had called happily, his voice echoing through the house. "Guys, come here! Someone wants to see you all." Soon enough, the rest of the clan appeared outside, following Five through the mist blanketing the courtyard. Six was looking at his feet, his hands clumped firmly around his key. Even his wild hair seemed to droop. The twins clung to one another tightly, still looking incredibly sad. Two looked at Five in question. The heartbreak was easily readable in his old features. The resilient old man was limping heavily on his cane, for he was very weak. Eight still wore the same expression he had when he carried Nine's lifeless body out of the fire. What could you possibly want, Five?" One growled, using his staff to help him walk. He seemed very sour and very tired. He had hardly slept, haunted by the horrid memory of Nine's death. "Who wants to see us?" Instead of replying, Five simply smiled widely and moved aside to let 6, 2, the twins, 1, and 8 forward in confusion. "Hey guys," Nine cried happily, the joy evident in all his features. The others all froze, their eyes wide as they stared at him. The young man was supposed to be dead and gone forever. He looked beaten and battered, standing gingerly on his lame leg. His optic cracked, but he was still the Nine everyone had known. Seeing him suddenly alive and speaking startled them all. The twins took a step away from the ghost, frightened. "It's okay. I'm really here. I was given a choice, and I decided to come back. I wanted to live with my family. I'm home," Nine said, reaching forward with a reassuring hand and looking at each shocked face. Everything was still silent for a moment, as the truth sank in. Suddenly the twins both beamed, their pale faces lighting up with delight. Their eyes flickered in silent cries of joy as they broke away from the others. Running to 9, he smiled widely and opened his arms. Both the young boys wrapped their arms around him, though they were quite careful. 9 wrapped his arms around the twins, holding them close. They rested their heads on his shoulders, closing their eyes and breathing silent sighs of relief. He too closed his eyes, rubbing their backs gently. It's okay now, I'm here, he murmured softly. He rocked them tenderly. His cheeks leaned against Fort's hooded head. The twins nuzzled his shoulders as he tightened his hold on them. The younger man who had protected them, loved them, and had become their elder brother was back. He had come home. 9 and the twins then withdrew simultaneously. 9 placed his hands on the younger one's pale cheeks, still smiling softly. They grasped his hands, looking both overjoyed and relieved. 6 was smiling widely, the dull black stripes on his face stretched. He was the second to walk up to 9. He smiled down at 6 and clasped his striped ink-stained shoulders. The small seer looked up at his friend with relief. Even he couldn't see anything so sudden. Something so sudden, so wonderful happening. But it had, and he was extremely grateful. Then 9 lifted his arm and put it around 6's shoulders, hugging him tightly. 6 blinked up at him in surprise. No one had ever given him a hug. But the gesture invoked something within him, a happiness he had never felt. Raising his own arms, he hesitantly hugged 9 back. It was kind of shaky, as if he needed to be taught how. But he expressed his joy that his friend had come back just the same. 2 then came hobbling forward, sighing in relief as 6 withdrew from 9. My friend, my son, he said, walking towards 9 with the open arms and outstretched. 9 reached back to 2 and folded his son with a tight hug. 9, my dear lad, you wonderful boy, you brilliant young man. 2 whispered softly, rubbing his back gently. Oh, how I missed you so. He placed a hand on his back of 9's head, and he buried his face into the elder's warm leather shoulder. The others looked on happily. 8 was smiling, and his arms were crossed. 1 gave a true, genuine smile and walked forward to 9 and 2, as 9 and 2 withdrew. He reached up and placed his hand on 9's shoulder. The younger Stitch Punk looked in mind, surprised by his touch. Welcome home, 1 said gently. The old war veteran nodded in approving, as 9 gave him a smile as well. Thank you, 1. He replied. He looked at the face of his coven, all smiling at him. He couldn't even begin to comprehend how he felt. The happiness, the relief, it all nearly overwhelmed him. The war was over, forever now. They were finally 9, and he finally had the family he'd been longing for so long. Suddenly, as he made a slight turn, another shot of pain exploded in his side, and he couldn't keep back the gasp all of a sudden. Intense feeling. He clutched his side, no longer able to stand. He sank to his knees, closing his eyes, and struggled to breathe evenly. He was completely exhausted and could barely move. Each breath he took sent shocks of needle-sharp pain in his chest down into his side. The clan immediately surrounded him, reminded that he was still gravely injured. 7 and 5 were instantly crouching beside him, their hands on his back and gripping his arms. I'm alright. I'm okay. He reassured them, bending his head and exhaled slowly. 7 and 5 each took one of 9's arms and slung over their shoulders, gently bringing him to his feet. 9 winced but gave a sigh of relief. He could finally allow 5 and 2 to heal him, and he wouldn't have to fight against the pain any longer. 5 and 7 helped him walk back to the house, the rest of the coven following closely. They all walked into the room where 9 had lain. The cot 5 was going to use just as a wooden board held up by 2 halves of the candelabra. He quickly directed 6 and 8 to gather some blankets and pillows they had scavenged, and for the twins to find some rope. Within minutes, the 4 stitch punks had made a cot far more comfortable for 9, and 5 helped him lie on his back. He gasped in pain, and the others looked on worryingly. However, as the healer eased him down, he felt himself relaxed as soon as he was able to lie on his back. He was easier to breathe now, and some of the pain quieted. As 2 walked out to fetch the supplies they needed, the rest of the clan took it as their cue to excuse themselves. The twins grasped 9's hands one last time, and the 3 sharing a smile. 6 smiled widely and waved before the twins took his hands and walked out with him. 8 winked down at 9 and turned to walk away. 1 stayed for a moment, looking down at the young man as if he wanted to say something. Suddenly, 2 brushed past him, wheeling a small cart full of various items. 1 shook his head and quickly turned away. 5 and 2 started spending out materials on other boards of wood held up by an empty spool right beside his cot. The older stitch punk looked through a moment, then stopped 8 from exiting the room and asked him something quietly. The guard hesitated for a moment, then nodded and left the room. 2 turned back to 5 and looked over their tools as they walked and made sure they had everything they needed. 7 sat down beside 9. "Are you okay?" 7 said softly. 9 opened his eyes and smiled gently up at her. "I'm alright, just a little tired," he answered, smiling crookedly. 7 smiled back before his expression was softened. She looked down for a moment, trying to think of what to say next. However, before she could, 9 reached over and slipped his hand underneath hers, squeezing tenderly. She looked back at him, exchanging a silent promise as he held the hand tightly. She could feel him relax as he sighed. The feeling of finally being somewhere safe and comfortable was enough to put him to sleep. He felt completely limp, exhausted both physically and mentally. He lived his entire life in worry, but now he didn't have to. He could sleep peacefully and know his family was going to be there when he awoke. However, as he turned his head to see 2 and 5 bustling around the table, strewn with multiple tools like needles, threads, scissors, and a piece of glass, and other instruments, 9 didn't have a name for it. He knew he needed healing first. He knew he was just injured deeply and the surgery was going to be long and excruciating. Nevertheless, he was grateful he had finally allowed 5 and 2 to heal him, and that the pain would no longer last forever. 9 thread and tied a long, thin strand of dark gray string through the eye of a needle. He laid down and reached for something off the cart. He and 2 then turned back at 9. They both looked a bit worried. Are you ready? 5 asked him softly, resting his hand on 9's shoulder. The injured cispunk smiled gently up at them and nodded. 5 then reached above 9's head. 9's sight was still disrupted by his optic, but as soon as he felt a slight buzzing in the center of his head, his entire body suddenly felt incredibly heavy. He realized 2 had borrowed one of 8's magnets to anesthetize him. He heard 2's voice speaking to him, telling him that he would have to remain awake for the surgery, but the magnet would disrupt the receptors in his head to dull the pain just enough to make it through. 9 couldn't register his words, but he managed to nod. After a moment, 5 put down the magnet and brought forward the scissors. 9 closed his eyes and turned his head away, bracing himself. He felt the cold steel of the scissors against his side. cutting the thread that had kept him together until the war ended. 9 inhaled sharply and curled his fingers into fists. Another slot of pain raced through him as his side was opened, but it wasn't excruciating. 5 then proceeded with the operation. His delicate, skilled hands reached inside the cut he just made, feeling around and getting a certain conclusion of how badly 9 was injured. 3 of his 4 ribs were broken or dislocated. That was immediately obvious. 5 investigated deeper, shaking his head slightly as he realized how badly his friend was injured. He'd never been able to understand how 9 made it so far. He made sure that his heart and tiny circular box hidden beneath his voice box that sent tiny pulses of electricity through his body hadn't been damaged when the deadly light of the talisman had struck him in the chest. Taking a deep breath, reassured, he took one of the strange-looking metal instruments off the table, asked 2 to hold something apart, and reached back into 9's body. The surgery was long and arduous. More than once, 9 felt something happen to his ribs or his hips, or a wire that would make him grimace and turn his head away. He struggled to keep quiet, knowing that his friends were working as gently as they could. Despite his nervous nature, 5 never faltered in his mission, brow furrowed and in concentration. The only thing that gave away how anxious he was how he glanced at his brother's pained expressions and whispered, I'm sorry, it's almost over. And I would try to murmur, it's okay, but reached out and searching for 7's hand. 2 would give a word of encouragement to 5, and the 2 continued. 7 remained at 9's side the entire time. She made sure to stay out of the way, but couldn't bring herself to leave. She kept to his side, keeping a tight hold on his hand. She reassuringly stroked his forehead as his brow furrowed, clenching his jaw as another arrow of pain shot through his body. It was late in the afternoon by the time 2 and 5 finished healing the young stitchpunk, and I knew he was no longer injured, and he took a deep breath, that the needle's sharp pain was no longer piercing his chest. He exhaled in a sigh, finally relaxing. 2 slipped a needle through his side, pulling a dark thread through the rib and closing it tight. He snipped it off with scissors, then sighed deeply. 9 was finally completely healed. The only indication he had ever been hurt was the scar that trailed down his side. His broken optic was even fixed. 5 placed the tools they'd been using back in the table, then looked over at his friend with a mixture of anxiety and relief. He lay still, breathing deeply. You all right, lad? 2 asked softly. 9 opened his eyes and smiled weakly up at the 3. He nodded, his voice rasped silently, and said, Good as new. 5 chuckled before reaching down and placing a hand on the back of 9's head and bending him down. Touching his forehead, and to his relief, the younger stitchpunk reached up, resting a hand on the back of 5's neck, gratefully that he was able to come back to his brother. He managed to smile before his body finally relaxed as he could no longer move. Every last bit of his strength was gone. However, when he felt a tender compression around his hand, he slowly turned to his head and looked up at 7, still holding his hand. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. She gave him a tender smile, as her face blurred suddenly. 9 could already feel the darkness envelop him. But this time, he welcomed him gratefully. He wasn't scared. The last thing he registered before completely giving up his consciousness was 5's hand, gently stroking his shoulder and giving him a reassurance that he was finally safe. As he fell to sleep, he desperately needed. 5 and 2 turned away and began to take the supplies from the table and put them back on the cart. All was finally peaceful, and they could now rest their weary souls. By the time they turned around, 7 was bent over, still sitting on the thimble. She had fallen asleep, her head in one hand and the other still holding Nine's. 5 and 2 grinned at the two young Stitch punks. 5 pulled a blanket over Nine's body, making sure he was warm. With another blanket, he covered 7's shoulder without waking her. Picking up the supplies, the two quietly walked away from 9 and 7. Tool pulled around the curtain, a curtain that had set up as a door, blocking out any light from the rest of the cabin. The flame from 2's top hat faded away. It left the two to rest and heal together in the darkness. End of chapter 29.